The Demonskar Legacy, the fifth part of the Shackled City adventure path, written for characters of level 8 through 10. This adventure came out of Dungeon Magazine 104. It is a 54-page adventure as part of a larger series of adventures. You see a demon here, possibly a Glabrezu, fighting, in fact, it is a Glabrezu, fighting some adventurers. It's the opening page. It is written by Tito Liatti with artwork by Matt Cavota and Jeff Carlisle. Cartography again by Christopher West. A lot of the same designers made a lot of the different Shackled City adventures, although they were often written by different writers. This adventure, again, like many of the others, begins in Cauldron. Here's a lot of background information. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. If you've seen my other videos, you will be somewhat familiar with the prior adventures in Cauldron, such as Flood Season, for example. Here's the map of Cauldron with many of its locations and all that, which very much come in handy. Again, it's a city or a large town built into the crater of a dormant volcano. It was written for 3rd edition. You get a lot of information on who lives here, what the city assets are, population, main characters that happen to live in the area, many of which at this point the players have been introduced to, at least to some degree. They recently, in a prior adventure, met Senshin Tesseril, the half-drow monk bard druid, for example. She may be an adventuring companion at this point. And they'll be very familiar with Genya Arrakis, who makes an appearance in this venture as well. Now, various events have happened in Cauldron, and events continue to happen as the plot is thickening in Cauldron, the overall plot, that is, involving a group called the Cage Rights. Although we'll get that more into that in a later installment here. As we go over here, we get to the Rumor Tables of Cauldron. I would definitely recommend using this rumor table to at least roll it once or twice at different times. You can even use it between adventures. For example, if you ran Flood Season and then Zenith Trajectory before this, maybe do a kind of intermediate adventure or a small adventure before it where the players hear some of these things, such as the gnome peddler named Flizmat meeting Alex Tercival at the Lucky Monkey. The players should be familiar with the Lucky Monkey and may have heard the name Alex Tercival before. In a prior adventure, I suggested dropping his name at one point because he is important here, and perhaps using other rumors here as well. Now, as a recap for this adventure or a brief synopsis, there is a political situation in Cauldron that happens involving taxes, and over time, some events happen in Cauldron, and then the player characters begin looking for Alex Tercival, who is a paladin of St. Cuthbert. As you're going through the beginning of the adventure, you get the chaos in the streets. This is caused when about 700 people gather around the city hall to protest the taxes being raised in the city, which have been squandered as a result of some nefarious activities by the main villain, Valantru, or Lord Orbius Valantru. Of course, the players don't know this yet. Valantru has hired half-orc mercenaries in the last few weeks to boost the city guard. The guards are trying to contain the gathering around the city hall, although the mercenaries will make an appearance in the area. And the merchant Mavu shows up in order to try to speak to the crowd. He's definitely affected by the tax increases as well, but he is more or less a character who is on the player character's side. He is an honest merchant for the most part. He also, or someone might mention to them, it could be Mavu, it could be Genya Eurakis, that Alex Tercival, the paladin of St. Cuthbert, who has been out of the city for several weeks, is supposed to be at this gathering, although he does not make an appearance mysteriously, and nobody really knows why. The Striders of Flairlang may also have some agents in the crowd. If any of the players are members of their society, they might be those agents. And the player characters might be on good terms with Celeste from Zenith Trajectory, who might pay them 500 gold or 50 platinum to simply go to the demonstration on her behalf and keep an eye on things. That's a fairly good amount of gold for doing very, very, very little. And then again, as I noted, Jinya Rakis may be very worried about Alex and may believe that he's going to be there and might send them on her behalf there to keep an eye on things. She might actually go herself. The DM wants to put her there as well. And there's good descriptive text as the players are there. Here's the riot scene with the map, zoomed in map of Cauldron. I'll note this may seem somewhat familiar as there was a prior battle just to the right of this in, I believe, the last adventure that involved an Umber Hulk bursting out of a warehouse. Again, that happens on the north part of the city on City and Avenue, and this just is to the west of there. There's a lot going on and a lot of people out in the streets here as it's a fairly big gathering. Now, I'll note when Mavu is trying to talk to the crowd, and you can see where he's at the speaker's dais, the players will be sort of in the crowd as things are happening here. Mavu speaks, and the captain of the guard shows up, possibly with a group of half orc mercenaries as well as the guard, and tries to arrest Mavu. It's around that time that a member of the Last Laugh, the Thieves Guild here in Cauldron, takes advantage of the situation and tries to incite the mob, yelling for the mob to kill the half-orc thugs. They're not wanted here, something like that. And then a riot actually begins. Someone during this battle releases a creature called a blood drinker. No, sorry, not a blood drink, a breath drinker, which is essentially a type of air elemental. The DM could be a purist and look for this 5e version of this type of elemental if you're playing in 5th edition, or you could just use a regular elemental. This adventure was designed again for 3rd edition, but it's not that hard to convert it to 5th edition. And again, when I ran this adventure, along with the entire campaign, I ran it all in 5th edition, and it wasn't too difficult to transfer. As you go through here further, you get some information about different guards, different events that are happening. I won't go into great detail. You get Mavu Arlental's stats. He's part wizard, and in 3rd edition, he's an expert, so it's kind of like a commoner class. You could just make him, a low-level wizard, like 5th or 6th level, and in 5th edition, it would be fine. Got the different members of the guard. You get the breath drinker in 3rd edition for its stats, and different individuals. You get round by round things that might happen. I would recommend if you're running this in 5th edition, maybe kind of loosen these rounds up a little bit and really think about what might happen. For example, round 9, the Cauldron security platoon arrives on the scene and they begin to basically firing arrows into the crowd. And, the DM can be a little loose with this. You don't have to be exactly by the book of what happens on what round, but it gives you a little bit of additional information. Like throwing the blood drinker in on round 3 is fine, but you don't need to be exact about exactly what the blood drinker does for every round. You can play it a little off the cuff a little bit. If the player characters save Mavu, which I would hope they would, it's kind of the intention, then Mavu will invite the player characters to go to the nearby town of Redgorge with him as soon as they're able, as he wants to leave the city, as the city guard are out to get him, and he believes Redgorge is much safer. Also, he has friends there with an organization called the Chisel. He also tells them that he believes Alex Percival should be there to answer some questions, especially about things that have been happening in Cauldron and information he's found, and that they can meet him at the Redhead Miner's Inn in Redgorge, and it will be given a question, and the answer will be Mortor. Not Mort, not like the land of Mordor, but Mordor as in a mortar and pestle or something similar. Here's an image, by the way, that's not the breath drinker. That's actually a huge fire elemental. We'll get to that. But after this event happens, the players don't have to go right away. They could stay in Cauldron later that night as they perhaps gather supplies and ready themselves. It's assumed that Mavu departs immediately, one way or another, to get out of town. But that night, two huge fire elementals are released in the city down by Crater Lake at a boarding house, cheap inn called Minuta's Board, where a few half orc mercenaries that are working for various nefarious forces are staying. The Last Laugh releases these elementals through magical means. I mean, there are elemental gems that can release such things, regular fire elementals. This adventure presents them as huge fire elementals. You may be able to find some in 5th edition, some statistics for essentially greater fire elementals, which is what I used. And you could say that technically that would be like a greater elemental gem that would be rare. It doesn't matter too much in this case that have been released. Or if the DM doesn't want to do that, you could release just 4 regular fire elementals, and the player characters are nearby when this happens. Maybe they smell the smoke, or they see the fire burning. It could be that they're actually at the inn and they are they notice what's happening. Maybe they're gambling, or they're meeting a friend there, or they're talking to a fence outside and trying to sell off some magic items. Maybe they're just gathering information. There's a lot of things the DM could do to make them more involved in the situation. And again, this happens the same night as the riot, effectively. Now, after the player characters get here, they're going to most likely end up fighting the fire elementals. The members of the Last Laugh perhaps run away, or it might be notable that they are the people who caused it, or they might hear rumors that the Last Laugh set this thing up. But the player characters, the Last Laugh is not the most important thing in this adventure. They're kind of like a side plot that happens. Then again, the player characters could look into it in more detail if they really want that night. By morning, order would be restored, however. Town criers will be announcing this throughout the street. The players will hear this. The Lord Mayor will pardon all citizens involved in the riot, and people who were arrested will be released, except for the evil merchant Mevu. He's probably escaped the city if he's alive, but the city has confiscated his property, which he owns quite a few different businesses in town, and has sentenced him to death in absentia. And Town criers have also publicized a letter from Alex Tercival, a letter of challenge, which is part of what aided to set off the riot, but cite reliable sources that the Paladin of St. Cuthbert has been possessed by demons to, you know, basically defame him. The Lord Mayor declares the challenge, of course, null and void, and the government offers a 5,000 gold piece reward to find and save the possessed paladin from wherever he is. And some of this stuff is also revealed maybe by the town criers. All half orc mercenaries as well are to be transferred to encampment outside the city walls, which gives the player characters the opportunity to maybe do a little side quest or side trek dealing with some of them as well. They kind of come in pretty quickly in this adventure, and they sort of get pushed out of the city rather quickly. If my one recommendation I would have is that the DM between this adventure and Zenith Trajectory maybe introduce the fact that the half orc mercenaries are being hired and coming to town and starting to become a problem. Maybe the players have already had a run in with them in like a side quest adventure, maybe a 1 or 2 session adventure, just building up to what's happening in this adventure. This also allows time to pass a little bit. This adventure also begins in the spring, although flood season, when it's essentially winter, begins in the winter, and then there is Zenith Trajectory in the middle. There's a lot of quite a few bit of time that passed during that time. So the DM could have the player characters doing downtime. The DM could have the player characters going on a few little side quests that might take them out of the city, or just be busy with other things. But you might need to be creative to, explain why so much time has passed since the player's last adventure, and make sure they've gotten things done. My group, we didn't have that much time passed. It was only a few weeks, but if you can, stretch it out a little bit and just have the players take care of things in the background. Anyways, player characters eventually get to chapter 2, the chisel and the staff, where they very likely will begin hearing rumors about different things happening in the city. They may have left the city already on their own, but the adventure doesn't present it that they have to leave right away. Now, Alex Turcival and Jenya were both followers of St. Cuthbert. They're also childhood friends. Player characters are probably familiar with Jenya Eurakis from prior adventures. She's a regular NPC in this campaign and a priestess at St. Cuthbert. And she will essentially give them a little bit of an extra nudge if the player characters don't really know what to do, or if they're for some reason not willing to leave Cauldron and go to Redgorge. She may notably note that he was last seen recently in Redgorge within the last 10 day or so, and that he often, when he was in Cauldron, when he went, he was an adventurer. Obviously, he's a paladin. Would come back to town throughout his various adventures in the wilderness around Cauldron, and he would sell art objects that he found to a halfling by the name of Tygot Mispass of Tygot's Old Things. I recommended in a prior adventure, I believe it was Zenith Trajectory, when the player characters are at the cusp of sunrise, that Tygot might be there and introduce himself, and knowing that he'd be in more of a moderately important NPC in this adventure. But player characters can then go to his shop to speak with him. They don't have to do this, although I would recommend implying that it's a good idea. The DM, you don't have to railroad them here. If they don't want to go there and do that, they don't have to. But it would make the adventure later on much easier. Now, Jenya has already used the Star of Justice and magical axe with prophetic powers, which is notable in Life's Bazaar, to cast divination on Alex's current activities. She has some sort of a cryptic idea of where he is, laid on the path of justice, trapped between glass and stone. He weeps where many can see him, but he can only see himself. Very cryptic and interesting. I would definitely use this description in the adventure to give an idea, subtle idea of what's happening to him. Now, if the player characters do go visit Tygot, who is 120 years old, although getting in, he is a halfling, a very old halfling, but halflings do live quite long. They will check out his two-storied shop, which is sort of an antique shop cluttered with all kinds of interesting items. As they get here and they see some of his treasures, I would throw in the possibility that maybe he has like an item he could sell to the player characters, like say a figurine of wondrous power for like a high price. There are a couple of figurines. I think there's a magical horse figurines that perhaps he has one of three of them, but not all of them, that he might make them an offer to sell. Or maybe he might even offer to buy some items while they're there, thinking they're just there to buy and sell. It, the player characters in a lot of these adventures will end up with a lot of random items. So this is a good opportunity to the players to sell some things off or maybe purchase something interesting. Maybe he has like another little trinket, like a quail's feather token in the shop that they might see on the shelf behind glass, and he might tell them the price for. Now there are a number of very interesting items that were sold to him that he'll show the player characters if they ask what kind of items that Alex brought to him, which is kind of a stretch. But if the players pick up on it that this is important, then they need to look into these items as a clue to what happened to Tercival. They're going to get a lot of information here. Although this information, these two handouts are definitely pieces of information that you want the players to see. If they don't get this information, the adventure will be more challenging and the player characters might find themselves kind of lost, but there are ways to kind of get them on the right path. Notably, this map down here is going to be extremely interesting. It involves a river and the location of a headless statue of a Glabrezu seen in the beginning, sort of, and also a trek through the jungle leading to a location called Thabrak's Voice, which is essentially a hill giant cave and some other areas. But also information concerning the larger threat and a group of individuals called the Spellweavers, which ties into the whole campaign. They're like six-armed, alien-looking looking humanoids. But anyways, this is some interesting handouts you can give to the players, essentially if they see the silver plate, which is one of the items sold to Tygot. Now, again, in addition, Alex's treasure shop is a great campaign seed. he might actually tell them about some other trinket that he wants to get his hands on that might be a side quest. And I always recommend player characters do side quests, especially if the DM wants to have some time pass and needs them to leave the city. Perhaps they travel out into the forest for a couple of days and come back, and they go on a little adventure that gets them a little XP to catch them up, and maybe some extra items, and do a little job for him. It also kind of builds him up as an NPC where he's more of their employer as well. He will show them a number of interesting items, and this is a very interesting role playing segment when he shows them these items. The volcanic gosling, for example, a goose carved of deep gray polished basalt, which is kind of interesting, uh, which is connected to some other things in the adventure. Here's Tygot himself. This is an elderly blink dog companion he has, plus some of his treasures in the background. There's the Knight in Brown, a painting. There's the baboon mask, which is quite interesting, made of dark wood, and it has a reference to flood season. There's the God of the Lake, a bust of a fish-like monster head, a kopru. The players might recognize it or what it depicts. And then importantly, the hegemonic plate, this rectangular plate of silver with odd figures and ciphers on it, and that crude map carved into the back, possibly with a knife or a dagger. This is the most important part of this adventure, or this segment of the adventure, that the DM really should show the player characters. It gives them a tremendous amount of information. In fact, I'll go back up here. You'll note the DM shouldn't point this out to the player characters other than saying, maybe implying that the players should look into the details of the plate a little bit more. You might want to show that note these symbols up here. Look at the detail in this figure and this shape above him, or whatever it is. It's have the DM really emphasize some things about this, because these plates are very important again for the actual adventure. So the DM should be aware of that. As you're going through here, the adventure also notes there's a haunted village in the area. This is basically filled with undead that has nothing to do with the main story, but it's a good side quest, especially if the player characters are a bit lost and they didn't visit Tygot and they need some lead. You could say perhaps that this is one of those locations that Alex Tercival has explored or has a history with, and so the player characters might have a reason to go there. It may simply be, more XP to get them a little higher level, or a little more experience and a little more treasure, or just continue their story. It could also be a personal quest connected to the player character's background. You could even throw in a couple other possible locations that Alex is rumored to have visited, which might give the players some clues as to where he could be, especially if they haven't found the plate. But they might actually, perhaps if they go to one of these locations, maybe there might be a tie-in to some treasures that might have been at that location that will lead them back to Tygot. Um, which again, Tygot is very important. This location is very important. There's no reason to force the players to get moving directly toward Redgorge necessarily, but if they do stay in Cauldron, I would say have them have run-ins with the half-orc mercenaries again, or maybe they're having a few rough encounters with the guards. Maybe the guards are just kind of in their face during that time, and indications that things aren't so well in Cauldron, especially if they stick around. And some groups might not want to leave town, but this adventure, they really probably should. It's part of the whole quest. As the adventure continues, the players will eventually leave town, either on a side quest or they will follow Mavu to go to Redgorge. This adventure and many others like it has a really good map of Redgorge, which lies a few days away from Cauldron through the mountainous jungle area. There is a chance of random encounters on the way to Redgorge, of course. I would suggest throwing in a peddler, which I don't think DMs use enough. A peddler is essentially somebody with a wagon who just sells random trinkets and random things they pick up. These could be common items that the DM prices from the player's handbook that might be a decent deal. It could be some partially broken items that the players could mend and fix with their abilities, but also throwing in a couple of minor magic items that, like a random potion, low level scrolls, some interesting items that they might pick up for resupplying, and or possibly have the peddler offer to purchase things for a set price. Like, say, if they have some random uncommon items that they're not using, maybe the peddler offers them 250 gold for it, or, a couple of gems for these items. Otherwise, the players will take a bunch of time trying to sell items, or more likely, they'll end up with a large number of random items that they're just carrying around. My group ended up with a lot of such items, and I tried to give them more opportunities to sell these items as much as I could. This also puts in a random encounter that's not necessarily hostile and leads to more role playing. And a peddler, for example, is the kind of person who might have picked up rumors, including false rumors. Again, going back to the rumor table, maybe they talk to the peddler and he tells them a false rumor he might have heard about some knight with a unique symbol who might have been Percival, who may have been northwest of Cauldron instead of near Redgorge recently. And the players might have a false lead, which turns out to be a dud, but it would actually eventually get them on the right direction. It would also make them a little wary of hearing rumors and question rumors a little bit, whether or not they're entirely true or not. Eventually, though, the player characters will get to Redgorge. The DM could hint that's the direction to go. They could go. They could basically, and they find that maybe they have a personal connection to Redgorge. So it maybe, in fact, one suggestion I have is maybe the owner of the inn is actually a great uncle of theirs or a cousin of theirs, like it's kind of a distant relative who will come into play in the adventure. Now, while the players are kind of going there, as I said, there might be some random encounters. This could be something that they encounter later. There's a random encounter table involving gnolls in the adventure. It could be some sort of demon, like maybe a singular demon that isn't too hard of a fight. This adventure does reference the Demonskar, which is a huge scarred area, which the players are going to eventually realize has something to do with this adventure. Essentially, all signs will lead to Redgorge eventually. During this time, I suggest as well that maybe one of the players has a unique dream involving those six-armed figures. Maybe one of the figures is doing some obscure thing up in the sky, and the players are witnessing this or seeing. Maybe they see a strange constellation that they're not familiar with, implying subtly that these six-armed figures are very important in such a strange way. I would definitely reference the stars in this particular instance, especially because there's a item later in the adventure called the starry. I think it's called the starry mirror, which is part of why Alex Tercifal is trapped. As the players continue on the way as well, there's an extra dungeon crawl that's actually underneath Red Gorge presented in the end of the adventure. It's not necessary that the players use it, but the DM could use it in Red Gorge. Perhaps if they hear rumors of a hidden base somewhere under the town, or the player characters, maybe they wake up in a dream and they have a dream adventure where they go through this mysterious dungeon crawl and they don't understand the relevance of it. There's a couple of things you could do with that, but I recommend looking into that as well as a little extra thing. But as they get here, finally, they will encounter an NPC bard. His name is Akal Akaim Smallcast, and he's honest in town. He's known as Honest Minstrel. He's an agent of Mavus. As the players get here, there is also a shrine of Pelor, as you can see. There's the Redhead Miner's Inn, which the innkeeper might be somewhat important. Now, the local adventurer and bard, Honest Minstrel, is the person who will basically tell the players a riddle of which they've already been given the answer to, the answer being mortar. He's kind of waiting around town, expecting them to arrive. He's one of those individuals that could sort of join the player character's party as an NPC to give them some extra muscle if they really need it, especially if they don't have a bard. Or maybe he's a bard friend or becomes a friend of one of the player characters. I'll note you have some basic information here on different individuals that come into play here. For example, Mikamax, he's actually the innkeeper. He's not really a adventurer. He's built as a commoner effectively with some levels. He has his own little, code name within the organization known as the Chisel. He's called Birdseed. Honest Minstrel is the code name of the bard, and there's a couple of different things in here. You also get the information on how much gold is floating around Redgorge. It doesn't have as many resources as Cauldron does, but that is available if the DM needs that, and have the players explore Redgorge as well if they can, just to kind of get a feel for it. As they're going here and they meet the bard, Honest Minstrel, he will let them know that the foreman wants to speak with them. And the foreman is someone, the leader of the chisel. His name is Illyrian Meshed. He's another adventurer who's recently returned to town. And the innkeeper will be there as well, Micamax, so Honest Minstrel, and Mavu would be there as well. They'll basically be given a private meeting underneath the inn or in a similar location to speak with the Chisel, part of a major organization in Redgorge that controls a lot of activities here. And there's more information about it in the adventure, but I won't go into detail about their history. As they have this meeting, and again, this is a major role playing segment in the adventure, they're going to come in and notice some beautiful frescoes on the walls in this private room underneath the Redhead Miner's Inn. This is all foreshadowing for different things that are happening in the campaign, and it's really important the players note this. Notably, the encounter between Surabar, who creates this magical wall around Redgorge, and an angelic figure granting him a glowing quarterstaff. This comes into play later. The quarterstaff is called Alcast. Perhaps have the player characters, if they see this, make an arcana check or a history check to recognize the story, and just kind of use this as a subtle way to imply the origins of the Chisel and Redgorge as a town. Now, as the player characters come in here, they're going to be introduced for a couple NPCs. I recommend drawing this out a little bit. Introduce the character of Alarin Mashed, and who's the foreman of the Chisel, and who sits at the table's head. Describe him in detail, kind of have him introduce himself as a strong leader of this group, and kind of show his personality a little bit, and have him offering them some wine and other things, and show his mannerisms so he stands out a little bit from the other characters. At this point, they've encountered Honest Minstrel, so have maybe Honest Minstrel playing a song in the background. Maybe the DM has some music available and they just play and say that Honest Minstrel is playing this song. Have Mavu show up and do a little role playing with the player characters, assuming he lives and he's here. And have the innkeeper Micamax also kind of interact with the player characters. And my suggestion is also, if possible, have one of the player characters somewhat related to like Micamax, or maybe the foreman, someone like that, so they have more of a personal connection here. Now, here, once the player characters get a feel for these NPCs and their mannerisms and their backstory, a little bit of their backstory, they'll know that Alex Turcival is supposed to be at this meeting and that this group expects him to be here. And he was supposed to be the fifth member of this council, but he doesn't show up. So where is he, is the question. Now, these individuals have divined, well, divined impending doom via various means. They think a great group of troubles are about to happen in the area. They're not sure what it is, but it's like the portents the portents suggest doom in the future, or they read the tea leaves, and the tea leaves all show black dogs or something like that. And I'll note that Honest Minstrel will warn the player characters about the last laugh, and believing somewhat falsely that the last laugh are probably behind these premonitions of doom somehow, and that if they go back to Cauldron, they should be very careful about them and watch out for more machinations from them. Now, they will note as well that, according to rumor, Alex was last seen heading downriver on a boat. This is the Red River, toward downriver somewhere, but that was a week or so ago. He hasn't been seen since. Now, note this does more or less go towards the Demon-Scar. The player characters probably will ask what the Demon-Scar is, so the DM should be prepared to give an answer to that, to give a little bit of history, but not like you don't have to give them a history lesson. Maybe have one of the NPCs give some background behind it and its creation, and also the history of Redgorge if it comes into play. The player characters at this point, if they haven't found the silver plate, it's going to be a little more difficult for them to find the right direction. Like, for example, this is a great opportunity for one of the NPCs to note that maybe Percival went to the haunted village and there's a bunch of undead there. That could be where he went or has been there before. Maybe there's another location in the area that's not in the adventure, but the one of the NPCs thinks that he could have gone there. The players could check that out. The important thing is give the players a few different leads, even if one lead seems the way more prominent. This gives the player character the option of picking the leads, and it gives them puts them in a driver's seat. You don't want to be the DM that tells you have to go this way. Give them like a bunch of leads, and even if you don't think they're good leads, just let them go which direction they want. And this is great if they pick the wrong direction because then some time passes. You move forward in time in the campaign, they get a little more XP if you're using XP, and they might pick up some other interesting items, and they might pick up a few more clues as to where the adventure and campaign is going to go by going on, for example, the wrong location, such as going to the haunted village, or like maybe there's a broken wizard tower out in the forest, or some random thing that the players hear about that they decide to check out here. Well, inevitably, the players will end up going somewhere after this meeting, after everyone in the meeting has says what they have to say. Inevitably, their players will likely want to check out the Demonskar, which they'll already know about, or want to follow Alex Turcival's path down the river. And if they have seen the plate, they'll have a really good idea that he likely is following a path down that river towards the headless statue and up towards Vaprak's voice. Players may even ask about these locations, and the DM should be willing to give them some information from the NPCs. And there's a lot of different bits of information here that will come into play. For example, if Honest Minstrel notes the information, the informants in Cauldron warned him about Tirsion Skellerang. I think that's the captain of the guards. And just different things that could come into play and should be mentioned during this meeting. And again, this should be a longer role playing session, like an hour or two, maybe, of possible role playing that happens between all these NPCs, including introducing them and all the player characters, and getting all this information onto the table, and then letting the players really make the choice of which way they're going to go. But eventually, they will find the right path and head down the river and might just accidentally come across the headless demon. This is the statue of a Glabrezu, which is more foreshadowing for later in the adventure. There are some gnolls in the area, and the player characters get here. As they do get there, there are some gnoll raiders, as they call them in 3rd edition, but you can change them out for gnoll brutes if you're playing 5th edition. They are found in the Grim Hollow adventure. There's a hunting trail the gnolls use that heads northwest toward the Demonskar, which matches the map of the silver plate. If the players haven't seen the silver plate, the players may just come to the conclusion that they have to head that direction. You can see the close map right here where the haunted village is, where the headless demon statue is, or Redgorge is, where directing back up into the mountains where Cauldron is. And I wouldn't show them this map necessarily with all these locations, but perhaps show them a crude map of the area that maybe the DM comes up with that marks where the Demonskar is, that there's a path going northwest, where the headless demon statue is, and where Redgorge is, and let them come to their own conclusions. There's a good chance they'll be like, yeah, we definitely need to go to the Demonskar one way or another. And the adventure strongly implies that that's going to be where Tercival went, especially with the rumors that he's been possessed by demons. As you go further in here, if they follow the path, they will find an area called the Old Ogre's Home, which has to do with the person who scratched that map onto that plate. Now, Tercival killed the ogre and left a wand there that in 3rd edition it ran out of charges. But if you want playing 5th edition, perhaps it's a broken wand, or maybe you could take the wand out and say maybe he left a pouch here that with a symbol of St. Cuthbert on it, or maybe some other item. In fact, if you, my idea for the pouch is could perhaps the pouch has the symbol of St. Cuthbert in it, and then there's a certain amount of coinage in it. And this is a subtle hint of the sequence the players will need later in the adventure, especially if they haven't found the plate with the information on it or figured it out. Now, the amount of coinage I would put in it is 3 copper pieces, 4 silver, 5 electrum, 1 gold, 2 platinum, and 3 small gems. This is very odd to find this treasure just sitting here in this pouch, but this exact number, these numbers match the sequence on the plate, which they'll need to solve the puzzle later in the adventure. I would not tell the players directly that these numbers are important. Just throw them in and let the players as a subtle clue. Players might think, oh, we just got a little bit of extra gold, but one of them, especially if you have some players that are kind of more insightful, might pick up on it, and they might even note that the numbers are similar to the plate if they found the plate. But this might come in handy. And again, it's an indirect way of giving them what they need to know and pushing them a little bit of nudging them in the right direction without like forcing them down that direction and giving them idea if they want to look into the lead here. But it also solves the issue in fifth edition of wands not running out of charges. So I suggest doing something like that if you can. There is a giant sloth, by the way, that you players fight here that's maybe eating the dead ogre for some reason, and there is a homebrew version of the giant sloth you can find online. This is the version I used. And then after this, the player characters will probably continue up the trail or explore the area. There is a random encounter table involving the gnolls in the area. There are a bunch of different gnolls. You don't have to use the table. Here's the table right here. There's some dire boars, for example, dire tiger, mega raptors, as dinosaurs live in this jungle. I would throw in there's a demonic hyena in fifth edition. I forget what it's called, but I would throw that in as well because it would fit this area very well. And throw it in and see if that works for the player characters as a random encounter. I forget what it's called. It's called the Susiva, actually. It's something like that. But do stuff like that. But again, this is a good opportunity for different side tracks as the player characters are going up this trail. Like perhaps maybe they see a side path that is not what they are expecting. It's not on the plate map, but it might lead somewhere nearby. Perhaps it leads to a hag's hovel that's in disrepair. There are some hags later in the adventure, and perhaps maybe this is the home of one of those hags the players can search, and there's some lesser creatures there that work for the hags. Maybe a hag spawn that was a playable race and creature from third edition, which might be interesting to bring in. Just some indication that there will be hags later on in the adventure. And again, one of those locations that the player, like a side quest, the player characters can explore as they're making their way on the right direction. Before they get where they really need to go, which is Vaprak's voice, they will find this Wings of Justice encounter. This is after they leave the old Urger's cave, and essentially they are visited by an angelic figure who basically implies that they need to find Alakas, a magical quarterstaff. This goes back to the frescoes on the wall of the hidden room underneath the inn back in Redgorge. And this diva who tells them this is kind of trying to point them on the right direction and trying to aid them. And any bit of help might come in handy here, especially if they feel like the player characters feel like they're lost. Perhaps the diva will point them the direction that it thinks that the Alec house will be, which will be up the trail or something like that. And it gives the player characters a direction again if perhaps if they don't have all the information they need and they need a little bit of a helping hand. As you continue on here, though, eventually, well, here's the information the diva gives them. They eventually get to a round cavern where the trail ends. It's essentially like a really big pipe that the players can travel through, and it cuts through part of the forest and eventually comes to into Vaprak's voice, which you can either have the pipe just exit here, or perhaps they just find one of the entrances of Vaprak's voice. The pipe is one entrance, and I think there's a cave entrance. It is a moderately sized dungeon crawl. You can see here's the cave here, and it has kind of a north entrance and south entrance. As they get here, they will encounter a number of mephits, which third edition they kind of level them up a little bit, advance them, but I don't feel like you need to do that in fifth. There will be some hill giants and some ettins the player characters encounter. There is a fire giant smith, and he has a +1 huge warhammer. I'd keep the warhammer, especially as a magic weapon, although it's way too big for the player characters to use. But he's supposed to have magic chain, a chain shirt, but it's incredible. Third edition adventures, they give out a lot of magic items. I suggest turning it into just full plate, like a regular fire giant would have, and not making it magical. And when they find the location where he's at, he is as an unfinished soul cage. This is an item that's going to come into play with the plot of the adventure as the campaign goes on, as the soul cages are part of a greater plot in this adventure that involves the Shackleborn. They're trapped in these soul cages later. I won't ruin it though yet. And perhaps describe the soul cage in detail, like it's an important thing, but it's not something finished or particularly valuable. This is more of foreshadowing for what happens down the line in this campaign. And in addition, they're going to find a location called, it's like a fountain, and it has this stuff called the Amaranth Elixir. And Alex Percival drank some of this, and it weakened his mind, lowered his wisdom, but increased his strength. I would definitely imply to the players that they should drink some of this. In fact, I would even ask them in game, do you want to drink some? If they once they've seen the description of this. The player characters will probably be very nervous about any DM telling them to do this or suggesting they do it, but the players probably should consider it and without knowing what it is. They could try to identify it as well with magic, which is a good idea, and the elixir will raise their strength depending on what size they are, and to a certain degree, and lower their wisdom. But it's an elixir that eventually wears off, so it's not a broken item that will unbalance your campaign. As you're going down here, there's some information on different things here. Let me get over to that. Let me see here. Go down here. We get to the elixir. It's down here somewhere. Here's all the details on the cave, the different creatures, descriptions of the different rooms, some traps, some various treasure the player characters come across. Here's the elixir. So there's the chart. And let's see, medium characters, their strength increases by 8, which is a huge increase, but they suffer a huge wisdom penalty if they're medium size. They might also be small size and be less affected by it. But every sunset, there's a 25% chance the elixir wears off. And if they do take some for later, it only works for an hour. So it's a very interesting item to throw in from the fountain, but it doesn't unbalance the campaign in the long run. It just makes the player characters much stronger, especially melee characters, for a short period of time, which is very interesting, and the player characters will probably be very interested in that and using that. There's another piece of art here which you can use and show the player characters. As you're getting further into the adventure, the player characters will encounter a bunch of hags and some interesting creatures which come into play here. The adventurer describes them as half green hags in third edition. If you're playing fifth edition, you could just make them into regular green hags. They don't need to be that powerful. They're not like meant to be an all-powerful force, but they do have some interesting creatures with them, including six-armed skeletons made from some of those creatures that the player characters saw on the plates. They're called spellweavers, by the way. And these skeletons, you can either build your own version of it, or I suggest using the skeleton warrior from Minsk and Boo's Journal of Villainy, but take away the great swords and give them 4 claw attacks instead. Or maybe have them 4 claw attacks and like they're holding a shield in one hand, or maybe the other hand just interacts with things because there's 6 hands. But that's a way of using these creatures, and they're much tougher than regular skeletons. Now, there's also creatures called Niras here. There's very specific types of Niras, which are going to come into play. There is someone who did a sort of a homebrew version of Niras, and I'll show what they look like. Here they are. There you go. That's what they look. They're crystalline creatures, and the ones you're going to use in this adventure are called Calorim Niras, and this is what it looks like right here. They also have these unique blades of crystalline material that might come into play here, and they're called Nira weapons. These are unusual weapons. The players won't be proficient with them, but they do have the wounding property. So the players won't have proficiency bonuses to use them, but they're quasi magical. I mean, the DM can say they're magical, or he can say they're just like they have this inherent ability. So they might be like, say, an item that would normally be attuned, but because it's a strange weapon, there's no attunement property if the players want to wield one. but it might be awkward to wield, and they're not an item the players can fix or easily gain attunement in, but it's kind of a unique item the players might find here. Anyways, this should be a very large battle no matter what, as the players are getting further into Vaprak's voice. And finally, the player characters, next to finally at least, they come to the Starry Mirror, which is the part of the conclusion of the adventure. It's literally a mirror where, beyond of which, Alex Turcival is trapped, and they will eventually go through the mirror. It's like a portal which will lead to many different locations, but the player characters don't know that the spellweavers can use it to go to different locations. The players have to figure out how to navigate the mirror, and this is probably one of the most complicated parts of this adventure. If, by the way, they try to use a sending spell to reach Turcival on the other side, because they can hear his voice once they go into the mirror, he won't be able to reply easily, as he's basically been driven insane. Perhaps if they send a sending spell, the DM could reply with random words that make no sense, but at least they know he's replying, and maybe even throw in a few words that are clues to what's going on here, maybe a color or something like that, or something about iron, or something about a ring, or just hints, essentially. Player characters are likely to get stuck here. The puzzles are difficult to use in D&D. Some groups do puzzles better than others. Again, I suggest if they haven't seen the plate, definitely use the pouch with the symbol of St. Cuthbert to essentially give them the combination, but they need to figure it out. Now, while they're here, they could fumble their way through to eventually get the right answer to get through the puzzle. And I'm going to go through here. You can see, by the way, this is the Glabrezu image. This Glabrezu image comes into play after this. But for this section, through the spectrum, I would definitely show the players this little map right here, area V15. This is the room before the Starry Mirror, which is the dislocation on the left. And these are what the rooms look like. Each one has a different color, and depending on how you run the adventure, this map, there's a blue one, for example, and different colored ones. It's hard to tell the difference in colors a little bit, so you might want to just mark the colors in front of the player so it's a little clearer for them. But again, definitely show them this so they know there's this throne looking at the mirror. There's each different color, that this is very important. And the DM doesn't have to show them the numbers. In fact, I would maybe just show them this. You don't have to show them each number when they go in here. That kind of gives a lot away. But you can describe the rooms as 15 feet wide and tall, and five-sided, with a mirror on each side of a different color, and that the color is very important. The players kind of have to figure some of this out. There's also an image down here. This is actually the image itself of the throne looking at the mirror. I would definitely show them this image, which will give them another bit of clues. This is the numbers or the sequence printed on the hegemonic plate. If the players didn't look at the plate, this might be very difficult for them to understand, or they may not know about this. Perhaps using the spellweavers to give them some sort of dream sequence instead, where they might see the sequence or have some understanding of the sequence in a dream. Like maybe they're in a battle in the dream, they actually get XP, but they are attacked in waves by different creatures during the dream, with the spellweaver looking on, like attacked by 3 orcs, followed by 4 goblins, followed by a hill giant, followed by a gnoll, followed by uh, 2 hobgoblins, followed by 3 uh, 3 bugbears, for example. Repeat this sequence, but you don't have to be super on the nose about it. Just imply that those numbers matter, so the players have more clues as to how to figure this out. Now, as they're going through here, again, the puzzle might be really challenging, and give the players some clues. Try to let them figure it out themselves. Eventually, they will figure it out. My player characters spent about 2 or 3 hours before they actually figured out the puzzle, and one of them realized that there were some interesting markings on the plate that would come in handy in solving this. And eventually they did solve it, although they definitely fumbled their way through it and eventually figured it out. But some groups are going to figure this out easier than others, and it is a challenge, and the DM will have to figure out. Finally, in the end of the adventure, they come to the ancient vault. And in room 1, that's where Alex Turcival is trapped and has been trapped for some time. He's going insane. He has a ring of sustenance that's keeping him alive. He's been slashing at a stone door on the west side, but he can't get through it. He can't break down the stone door with his weapons, but it has a few cracks on it. It may be that the player characters, for example, might have happened to have come across a potion of gaseous form, which the adventure says there's enough of a crack that that will get the players through the door at least. Maybe that peddler from earlier happens to have been selling one, or the players found one on a random encounter situation, or throw in that to help them out here because the players might get stuck here as well. If Tercival can't get to the door, what's to say the players can? But maybe if this level they might have some other ways of getting through the door that Tercival doesn't have. And again, he's completely delirious at this point. It's notable that Tercival would begin muttering prophecies. I would just have him start muttering things like this when they first meet him, and he's completely delirious, like chant a dirge of gold coins, your pockets are filled with lies. This is very interesting role playing and foreshadowing for what's happening later in the campaign. And again, the plot is thickening at this point in the campaign. A lot of things are about to happen in the next couple of adventures, and this is sort of the thickest part of the plot where it's really stirring up and things are going places. Eventually, the player characters are going to get out of that room after hearing the various prophecies that Tercival says. They'll escape, and they can't go back into the mirror as it's a one-way mirror. Once they escape, they will be attacked by a Glabberzoo, which has been hinted at throughout the adventure. Here's Tercival's stats, by the way. He's in third edition. He's part aristocrat, which is a commoner sort of class. You could just make him like a fifth or sixth level paladin in fifth edition. His aristocrat levels don't matter so much for the most part. You could keep a lot of his equipment, and he is intended to die in the battle or directly after it. It's kind of like, oh, Tercival has to die. But it's meant to be that if he dies, it's meant to be a sudden event where maybe right after the battle he collapses, and maybe there's a weird glow or mysterious something mysterious happens that kills him. Like you get outside the cave and lightning strikes and kills him out of the blue, and ends his life. So it should be a shock to the player characters. Of course, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be capable of bringing him back from the dead. They might have the revivify spell. I don't think it's that important that he remains dead. It's meant to be more of a shock than anything else. The player characters could use their abilities to bring him back, and he would just be like an extra NPC, perhaps someone who at first the players have to deal with because he's not quite himself, although he would become an ally, a powerful ally if he survives. There's really nothing stopping them from carrying his body throughout the adventure and bringing him back to life later. In any case, once they kill the Glabrezu sort of end boss fight here, the player characters will come to the conclusion of this adventure, and it's meant to be a cliffhanger. They exit the the ancient vault outside in a desert, about 500 miles from Cauldron. Most likely, there's a big desert in Greyhawk to the west of Cauldron, and I forget the name of it, but it's a huge desert where the player characters should realize that they're out in the middle of nowhere and they don't know what to do at this point until they start the next adventure in the series, which will kind of move them forward. And as you go further in here, there's some other information in the appendix, which I mentioned earlier. In third edition, there's a special prestige class that you don't need to use it in fifth edition. It's more a third edition thing. And then, like I said earlier, there's this Hall of Carvings. This is the little dungeon crawl underneath the inn and some other locations in Redgorge. I didn't use this for my campaign, but if you wanted to use it, maybe the players break into it or they wake up in a dream sequence and explore it, not knowing what it is. But there's some details of what's here. There's some caryatid columns, which are interesting creatures you can fight. They're like constructs that appear as like carved columns that attack. And there's some golems in here. It's kind of a hard dungeon crawl if the players go there, but they could go there, which could be interesting. And finally, we get the very end of the adventure here. Now, the great thing about this adventure is it has a lot of variety. There's a lot of different NPCs, and in interacting with NPCs, there's the potential for random encounters. There's a lot of exploration. There's a potential for a lot of different directions. There's single enemy fights that take place in Cauldron, and a riot that takes place, which is very different. There is a large dungeon crawl, but it's not too large, essentially. It's not like the whole adventure is a dungeon crawl. And again, there's the puzzle in the end, which is going to be a challenge for both groups, and it ends with a cliffhanger. Because of this, I would say that the Demonskar Legacy is a 5-star adventure, and which is continuing from the last couple adventures, which I also noted were 5-star adventures. And there are some other really good adventures coming up in this series that the player characters will get to play as well. Now, if you really like my material and everything I'm presenting here, I want to remind you guys, please like this, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It really helps. And stay tuned for the next one as I will be presenting the follow up to this adventure shortly.